Good morning, Suzanne. I'm Michael Sherberg from Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Suzanne Magnanini from the University of Colorado. And we are here to talk about Inferno 8 by Dante Alighieri. And Suzanne, it was your idea that we do a canto per canto reading of Inferno 8. So why don't you start off by talking about why you picked it?
Sure, Michael, thanks. Well, when we first started thinking about this, it was a much angrier time. So it was the summer of 2020, and lots of rage was there to be passed around. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about this canto, which is, we're in the circle of the wrathful and the sullen, and to think about rage in that way. But in rereading and thinking about it now, sort of down the road, I'm really interested in this canto because it leaves us somewhere in the middle. We're just totally unmoored in this canto because we're literally unmoored, right? We're on the boat with Dante. He's crossing the river. And also it begins with continuando, right? So we're sort of in the middle of something. We're in a liminal space in the topography of the Inferno as well. And so it's really this moment of passage and where things aren't really clear. What's happening, what's going on. And Dante himself is in this liminal in the boat. And I think it's a really scary place for the pilgrim in this moment, from being attacked in the boat to then not at the end of the second half of the canto, not getting into the city of Dis. So all of that coming together, I think, makes the canto really compelling. But I have to say, in my teaching, it's often one that we sort of do the Filippo Argenti episode and move on quickly to the gates of hell, right? So it's also one that we've maybe not considered as much as others or thought about.
Mm-hmm. I think you make a good point, lots of good points. Most of the text of Canto 8 is devoted to the arrival at the gates of Dis and the beginning of the crisis, right? Virgil's first attempt to penetrate the gates. He is rebuffed. Dante waits nervously while Virgil goes off by his own. All of that material is very attractive to readers, also because of this kind of the dramatic conclusion of that whole episode in the following canto. So I think that Filippo Argenti, who's clearly an important figure here, often gets lost as a kind of a brief interlude that we don't do much about. And to some degree, we don't do much about it because Dante himself signals that this is somebody whom we should ignore, right? History should not pay any attention to people like Filippo Argenti. And so we as readers are kind of directed to not give him his time of day because he's supposed to be unimportant.
Yeah, and yet I see him as so, I see that exchange as so compelling, sort of, and sort of the front and the back of that exchange, right?
Yeah.
And so, it starts with Phlegyas, who's the boatman, right? And he has sort of, in his classical sin, right, has burnt down the temple of Apollo, but because his daughter was raped by the god, right? And then we have the scene with Filippo Argenti, and then we have Virgil saying, blessed is the womb who bore you, Dante, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Which is, reference to Dante's mother, but it is very Marian, right, in its assertion. Another person or figure, right, whose child was harmed, we could say, and perhaps has reason to be angry, right, if we think of it in that way. And it really caught me because I felt rereading that this is most of the comedy is a male space, right? We're mostly meeting men, in the Inferno at least, right? We're mostly meeting men. And here, there's this kind of subtext of women, right, with Phlegyas's daughter on the one hand, and then Mary and perhaps Christ on the other hand. And they end up presenting us with two different reactions to harm, we could say, right? To harm of our loved ones. How could we react to that? We could react like Phlegias, enraged and burn down the temple, or we could be the accepting sort of Marian figure, right? So we have these kind of two figures on each. And then there's that exchange between Dante and Filippo in the center, which is absolutely rage-filled, right? And so, I don't know, that just got me thinking of these characters who don't really appear but are summoned in the canto in that way. And I think that I do like this canto when you're thinking about anger, because I don't want to say it's sort of a universal, because anger is, culturally constructed to some extent, right? But I think that it makes us think through, even in our own day, all these different sorts of anger and all these different kinds of reactions to anger and how anger works, right?
Yeah. The language of the canto, I think, underscores that. I was noticing that you have the word ira applied to Filippo Argenti. Oh, no, it's Phlegias, who's all wrapped up in his ira at line 24. But then Virgil praises Dante for his disdain toward Filippo Argenti a little while longer. So you have a kind of you have almost a category, and then there's the word furia applied to, or furioso applied to Filippo Argenti. So you kind of have a vocabulary of different types of anger, different ways in which we express our anger, which also goes to notions of good anger and bad anger, because Dante's response to Filippo Argenti earns praise from Virgil, right? So there's something okay about that, about whatever Dante is expressing there, as opposed to the other types of anger that you see expressed by the other characters in this scene.
Yeah, I think, it's kind of, I think Aquinas talks about that righteous anger versus, sinful anger or wrath, right? That we have to have. And sometimes the anger is a catalyst, right? And a positive catalyst. And I think what's fascinating here is Dante shows us that sometimes shared anger can be a unifier, sharing anger or sharing an object of anger can bring two people closer together. And while that might be positive, depending on how that's directed, I always wonder here how serious we're supposed to take Virgil's praise of Dante's anger, right? So, and I think it's really tricky, because I think on the one hand, Filippo is a sinner, right? We should,
right,
denounce what he's done and denounce his sin. On the other hand, especially in this first part of the Inferno, we see Dante sharing and often participating in the sins, or at least showing that he has the potential to sin like these sinners. And then what about what Virgil says? I mean, here's the guy who's about to be locked out of Dis, right? And here he is praising Dante. What are we to make of that praise, right? And is that praise a sort of evoking of the Virgin Mary, right? Or, blessed is she who bore you, the womb who bore you? Or is he somehow misquoting, And I think it's Chris Kleinhens who reads this as a different sort of reference, not to the Hail Mary prayer, but to another moment where someone yells out to Jesus, blessed is she who bore you. And he says, no, blessed is the word of God. So he's redirecting, right? So it depends on sort of how we read that moment, whether Dante's desire for revenge, because that's what he wants, right? He says, I hope Filippo is, something horrible happens
to him. Yeah.
It's his, right? And then he does, and then he's absolutely satisfied. So is that a good thing, or is that are we supposed to take Virgil, as praising Dante, and that is absolutely righteous anger, or is it somehow problematic? And I think those moments of doubt that maybe creep in, at least for me as a reader, make the exchange all the more fascinating.
I'm struck as you speak with the way in which the problem of which confusion basically permeates the canto, right? Not just in the final scene of are we going to get in or not, and why is it that we can't get in, but that Flejas arrives with a misunderstanding of why he's been summoned, right? He thinks he's come to pick up another anima fella, and Virgil has to correct him and say, sorry, not this time. And there's confusion throughout the canto of why is this person who's not dead here? We're asked to, reflect on that. There's confusion at the very beginning of the canto where Dante says, Io dico seguitando, and we're left to wonder, why is he backtracking? What is he trying to signal by backtracking? And we have the old, Boccaccio's theory about why that is, which seems silly and ridiculous today. And I think that we have to kind of read Dante's backtracking as yet another signal to us as readers about how we are to approach this text, which is as not just a retelling of what happened, but as an artistic reconstruction of what happened, because it is the poet himself who decides in what order to tell the story. The story may have happened chronologically, but at least right here, it's not. It's not being retold chronologically. So there are all these points of confusion that we as readers are asked to deal with. And he even reminds us that we are a lector, right? He uses that word. He addresses us as a pensa lector. Reaches out directly to us from the pages of the text to say, think, reader. Because he's training us in some way in this canto to think about the evidence that is presented to us, right? And what we get is evidence, but not necessarily interpretation. Interpretation is left to us. And I think that you see that repeatedly. Also, for example, in the way that Filippo Argenti refuses to identify himself. And we're invited to figure out who he is with Dante's help over and over again.
Right. I think that's really key, that idea of confusion. And maybe that's goes to what I was saying, that this is really an unmoored canto, right? Mm-hmm. We're in this kind of liminal space where we're trying to figure out what's happening. And it's interesting, if you sort of move from this canto through Canto 9, not only do you get, the first, I think, in the Inferno of the apostrophes to the reader, right, which will increase in Canto 9, but you get the beginning of a series of images that will become thicker, we can say more frequent in Canto 9, about sight and misseeing, trying to see, trying to make out what's happening, right? The flames on the towers, what are those exactly? What exactly are we seeing? Mm-hmm. Seeing the boat kind of come through the water towards them. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that this is a really weird canto because it has a whole group of sinners that we never see, who are invisible to us, right? All of those sullen people who are under the water, who we only see, we could say, by the bubbles on the top, right? So we don't really... there's something submerged, right? And something beneath
we have to excavate.
That we have to pull out. I mean, we're totally left not knowing who those, and there is Filippo Argenti. We do get his name, but it's the sinners who give up that name, right?
Right.
Filippo Argenti, and it's
not even Dante, right?
It's not Dante and it's not Virgil, right? So it's also, I think it's really an interesting canto for that reason, where Dante is really pushing us. And maybe it's before we move into the, if you're reading this through the Aeneid, right? This would be the moment where Aeneas and the Sibyl sort of go, oh, there's Tartarus. We're going to go in this other direction.
Right.
Horrible place. Let's keep going. Right. So it's maybe Dante preparing us for that, that new space we're going to have to enter with him, where we can't sort of fall back on, our reading of, the Aeneid, and
right.
nor can Dante Pilgrim, right? Who knows, as Virgil says, his poem by heart, right? So.
Yeah. And along those lines, Filippo Argenti rises up out of the water as an obstacle to the boat, right? He's going to keep the boat from completing its passage across the river Styx, which is essentially a moat around the castle of the city of Dis, right? So they can't move forward until they get rid of Filippo Argenti in one way or another. So there's an invitation here to an allegorical reading, which is, I would say, complementary to the allegorical reading of the obstacle that they're about to meet at the gates of Dis. In other words, he's a sort of a pre-obstacle to whatever other obstacle they're going to encounter along the way. So again, we are challenged as readers to understand, what do these obstacles mean? What does it mean that you have to get past Filippo Argenti, who embodies wrath, to be able to arrive at this place at the next spot along the way? And I'm not sure that I know the answer to that question, but it seems clear that that's what's being set up here, that in the liminal space that I absolutely agree with you, call it, there is no smooth movement, right? There's Phlegas is the first obstacle, who says, you can't get on my boat, right? And then Filippo Argenti is another obstacle, who says, I'm going to stand in your way. So Dante is being taxed here to justify his corporeality, and also to sort of justify his privilege, his right to cross. And again, we're asked, why is it that he gets to cross?
Yeah, true. And it's interesting. I've always found it interesting that here we have this evocation of dogs, right?
Yeah.
Where he says, via costa con gli altri cani, right? That's Virgil dismissing Filippo and sort of, you go over there with the other dogs. And it's interesting because I think, again, Aquinas talks about dogs as being an animal that's particularly given to rage. Mm-hmm. I don't know, there's a sort of list of animals, lions, daring, these sort of things. But dogs are also faithful, right? Yeah. You have that sort of, so there's this combination, and that's that interesting combination that I see here between sort of dedication or faith and rage, and how we navigate those two things. How are we going to be faithful to, our family ties, to our political ties, and perhaps defend them with righteous anger, yeah. Right? And then when does that anger become sin or too much? Right. And so it's an interesting way to sort of think about maybe partisanship or alliances in some way. And I wonder if some of that are some of the obstacles Dante has to get through, right? His own rage, his own, maybe partisan, he hasn't been exiled at this point, the pilgrim, but certainly struggling, and those struggles that are taking place and sort of ripping apart Florence. Yeah. In that way. So it's an interesting way of, I think, linking sort of, and also because, Filippo is a Black Guelph, right? So we have this way in which faithfulness, partisanship, politics, and rage are sort of brought together. Right.
Right. Right. And I think we have to, I find myself asking too, and I find, not just here, but elsewhere, because I see glimmers in Dante's projection of himself onto the text of the poem of, I won't say regret, but reconsideration of his own behavior. and particularly his political behavior. And every so often I see him asking himself, you just see a little shadow of him asking himself, did I do this right? Did I do something wrong along the way that I need to acknowledge and not just play the victim here of other people's plotting against me? And this may be one of those places where he's asking himself, was whatever anger that I displayed in my political behavior appropriate to the moment, or was I indulging in my own error, right? Because it felt good to be angry. I think those questions are here. And I think we can spend time thinking about them along the way, and not just in this canto. I wanted to add one other thing. I know that we're running out of time, so I wanted to show this to you. I found this image, which I found particularly striking, and I want to share it. There we go. This is an image of Filippo Argenti trying to climb into the boat. It's by William Blake, so it's from the early 19th century. And I was looking for images of Filippo Argenti in anticipation of our conversation, and I found this one, which I found particularly striking because, as you know, Filippo Argenti is covered in mud when he climbs out of the river Styx. And what I found striking about this is that if you look at Filippo Argenti's face, what I see is the face of a black man. In other words, William Blake has given him negroid features to kind of denote his blackness as muddy, right? The muddiness that is covering his body. And I found that so interesting as a way of, as how Dante reception sort of intersects with other discourses after Dante, because I don't think that Dante was interested necessarily in introducing the discourse of race into this canto, but other people found a way to later on. So I just wanted to, I don't know whether you see it, but I see it there.
I see
full lips, the nose.
I see what you're saying there. That's really interesting to think about that. Also, just looking at this image, I always thought that the boatman was in the galeotto rowing, not pushing the boat, right? Which gives us a different, and that look brings these faces together. And because this is such a, I think you might be right on that. And I think that there's that overlap of demons in the Middle Ages as being depicted not as Saharan African or Black, but as, colored Black, within a lot of the iconography. So it's interesting too that, the boat is called, the galeotto, right? Which is, I think, a slave ship, right? A ship that's rowed by slaves. And I wonder if Blake knew that or had any inkling of that, and then sort of displaces that idea. It's weird because it's called a galeotto, and then we don't really, it's not the typical galeotto in that we never really hear, is Flejas, is he like the leader, like the coxswain of this boat? Are there other people rowing? Is it just him sort of punting, or, sort of like a gondola rowing the single oar? We don't really know, but I wonder if there's that kind of slippage, and it would be really interesting to look at translations or, whatever Blake was reading at that time, or however Blake knew Dante.
It would have associated blackness with, racial blackness with,
Wow, that's super interesting. And I think that's a whole other
conversation. Yeah. Anyway, I do think we're out of time, so we will stop there. It was wonderful to see you, Suzanne, as always.
Good to see you.
And thanks for chatting.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
Bye-bye.